Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and today we are taking a look at chaplains. So we continue our look at HQ units across bolt action. Last week we were talking about a peer support unit in the form of the medic and the field ambulance. Today we are continuing in that by looking at the chaplain, the other kind of primary support unit available in the game so far for 3 out of 3 nations that have gotten armies of books. So we will see if that continues on to other nations. I don't personally see a reason why not. As far as I know, most armies have fielded chaplains at some point or another during this time period. So I don't personally have a problem with it going to everybody and just being a standard choice that everyone gets access to. But yeah, just kind of taking a look at how these work, because again, they have no real combat effectiveness. They are purely there to support and improve the work of other troops. And so more on that as we look at it. But the TLDR that you need to know on this one is, I actually really like chaplains. I think chaplains are really good in the game, even though I imagine a bunch of the more competitively minded people might disagree with me, but more on that as we get into it. Similar to last time, we're going to be looking at things kind of with a different eye because, we can't really do damage potential, pin generation, or anything else like that. But I think that there is some useful stuff. You're also going to notice that, by the way, Warlord has only made, as far as I know, one official chaplain model, question mark, that is at least available currently on their website. So you're going to see a lot of 3D print availabilities over here on the right-hand side throughout this. The one that you see over there is a Japanese Buddhist chaplain by Studio Historia as part of their Sons of Yamato campaign. So more on that you can check out over there. They got some very interesting stuff going on over there, so feel free to check them out. But suffice it to say, it's going to look a little bit different, but we are going to be kind of focusing on how to use your chaplain most effectively for the things you're going to need it to do in the game. So to start off with, your range and rate of fire is the exact same as a medic. You'll see that they have the self-defense special rule over there on the right-hand side where we can check out the medic entry, and it's a relatively simple entry. It's that they're not allowed to, they don't have any weapons, right? Weapons none, as you see over there in the profile. They are not allowed to assault enemy units. They will defend themselves if they are assaulted. They cannot claim objectives as part of that self-defense rule. And so, this is not an attack unit. Technically, this guy will defend himself, and technically, in the Soviet Union book, if you can take the NKVD subtype on them, you might be able to maybe take them with tough fighters. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you are under any delusion that one model, because you can't buy any extra men, with tough fighters rolling 1 dice is going to do anything reasonable by getting a reroll, I'm just telling you now, I think that's a waste. Okay, which way you cut it. I think you leave it at the cost that you see right here. Generally speaking, subtypes. Some subtypes can be very useful for chaplains. I think a Rangers Lead the Way subtype on a Ranger chaplain would be really good. I think a Guards chaplain is actually really good for the British, but in general, you probably don't really need subtypes. You can just kind of keep it as it is. And in general, yeah, like you really don't need to take subtypes, especially if it's like one of the stubborn or fanatic ones. Like even if you were afraid somebody was going to come after you with a flamethrower, if they want to potentially run out of fuel on a flamethrower by trying to barbecue a chaplain, I'd say just let it happen. And there's a very good chance that they're gonna get you. So, like in general, you don't really need them to have one of these, and you definitely don't need to worry about working on them offensively because this is not an offensive unit. This is a purely support unit. They're literally not allowed to perform aggressive actions, okay? What you really take them for is that inspiring presence special rule that you see over there on the right-hand side, where as long as they're receiving an order that isn't down, then they can select a friendly unit within 6 inches and roll a d6. And it does get modified. So inexperienced chaplains, it works on a 5+, regulars, it works on a 4+, veterans, it works on a 3+. The chaplain can remove a pin from the selected unit, which is really, really nice. And so looking at this opportunity cost, okay, when we factor in how many points you're paying and what the difficulty is to remove the pin, we need to realize that if you're assuming that a chaplain does actually live for 6 turns during the game, which is an assumption, but it is something that, we think about. First of all, an inexperienced chaplain is only likely to remove 2 pins. And if that's the case, I'm just going to tell you now, 17 points for a cheap order dice is not a horrible thing in and of itself, but as a pin removal tool, this is not a very good pin removal tool. For 2 reasons. One, it's unreliable. Yes, you will technically, on average, remove 2 pins per game, but you have no idea how important that particular pin was, whether it was completely unnecessary, but you didn't have anybody else in range, so you rolled it and it worked. But then when you needed somebody to really remove a pin to make sure that they pass their order test later or make sure that they pass a morale test soon, it fails, and so the unit ends up being lost or ends up not following orders, that's very swingy. And so because of that, while it is very cheap, personally, I would not run chaplains as inexperienced troops. Okay. You have regular troops at 25 points. You're going to remove about 3 pins per game. The odds are not horrible with that. It's a little over 8 points per pin that you're removing, which is not great. It's not horrible. And the fact that it happens roughly every other turn means that in general, even if a unit fails to pass an order test once, the chance that they fail a second time is pretty low. Because the chaplain's likely to catch them, remove the pin that time around, and they make it a little more reliable that they do their job. Could still be the difference between victory or defeat, but it is something to think about. Personally, when I run chaplains, I tend to run them veteran, even though it's a 33-point investment. If that 33-point investment is a simple thing that I can make to make sure that a unit actually does its job, ideally not modified by any pins at all, that is probably worth its weight in the units I will remove from the enemy that I would not have removed because of a -1 to hit modifier or because a unit failed an order entirely. And so because of that, even though it's only 4 pins per turn, well, per game, the math isn't actually horrible in terms of how much that is. It's only about 7.5 points per pin, which is not bad. And more than that, being one of the few ways to reliably help people get off a pin that would have otherwise stuck around because people were throwing 2 to 3 pins against something. This is a very, very useful tool to have. So I think but before doing this, and I think this is what really determines the opportunity cost behind all of this, is you need to step further back and you need to ask what your strategy actually is. Because in my opinion, if you include a different unit, or potentially multiple different kinds of other units, you really don't need a chaplain. Okay. And that is, how worried are you about pins on your units? Right? Like, if you field a company commander and he's an inexperienced company commander, he's going in a transport you're already planning on having, it's an armored transport to help keep him safe. Units failing order tests, you're not that likely to really have as long as they're in range of that +4 morale, heaven forbid, Great Britain morale +5 company commander. Removing 1 pin off of them is not going to dramatically change whether or not they pass the order test. It might change whether or not they are firing with a -1 to hit from having at least 1 pin on them, right? So there is still a place technically for chaplains there, but they aren't nearly as necessary. Okay, you might also consider running a chaplain if you're like, well, I do plan to run a company commander, but I intend for him to be way over here on this side of the board, and I just need somebody over here who can kind of, keep the mortar firing, right? Or keep the rocket launcher firing, right? Or something like that. Especially units that are pinning themselves every time they shoot, like multiple rocket launchers and flamethrowers. Having a chaplain near them could be really nice. Don't get me wrong. However, it again begs the question, how necessary is it? Because we've already paid the points out for a company commander who's arguably covering for the problem of people failing tests, right? Similarly, if you have a lot of veteran tanks who are going to be shrugging a number of pins, especially when they're staying at long range and then punching back at the enemy with really good weapons, do you need a chaplain? A chaplain could be really nice because, again, it's always nice when you're not firing on 5s or 6s, you're firing on 4s or 5s, possibly 3s or 4s, depending on what your armament is if you have an anti-tank gun. But at the same time, like, is it necessary to have a chaplain? Maybe, maybe not. It all depends, right? Depending on what you're doing, if you're not taking on as many pins as you would otherwise take on, a chaplain may not be that necessary. It might be better to spend your points on more bodies that can go about supporting those units. And then finally, if you really have a high order die count, does having a super cheap order dice actually matter as much? Right? The difference between 18 order dice and 19 order dice is not dramatic. Maybe saving those 17 to 30 or more points to instead purchase something else might be more advantageous, right? And so I'm not going to say that a chaplain is the kind of unit that's an auto include. It's not the kind of thing that should always be in your army, but there are definitely places for it, right? They do help to cover over things, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the video. So when we talk about objective holding, we run into a similar problem as we have with medics, right? Which we saw from the special rule. Over there, by the way, on the right, you're going to see the German chaplain model, a couple different variants presented by Micro Perspective. You can find them on Cults 3D. Just search for chaplain, and you'll find them there. But of course, the biggest issue that chaplains have is that on their own, they cannot hold an objective. If you have him standing on an actual objective token, and the enemy rolls somebody up within range, they will flip control of that objective, okay? What they are useful for is, one, keeping allies on an objective because they're less likely to run away, they're less likely to, fail an order test and just go down, which might mean that a unit that should be firing at the enemy and whittling down the enemy is not doing that job, okay? So you might be able to pull it down that way, which is excellent. But in addition, It can also by removing potential hit penalties for your defending units, right? And this is something we've talked about, right? The whole 2-pin thing, where if he removes 1 pin and then they pass the order test and they remove that 2nd pin, now they're firing without any penalties, which is really, really nice for maintaining volume, right? You also have the benefit of the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention doesn't want you shooting at chaplains, okay? They are protected personnel. And so you might play against an opponent like myself who will just say, I'm not going to shoot at him. Well, he's going to help my men. Yeah, of course he's going to help your men. That's his job, okay? But I'm not going to shoot at him because he's a chaplain, okay? And I'm going to follow the rules, right? Which is not to say that you should expect that to happen, but you might encounter an opponent who does that, at which point your means of removing pins might stick around for a good bit longer. You might even get all 6 turns in order to try to remove stuff. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to objectives, similar to what we talked about with the medics, you want to keep him in range of multiple allied units, right? If you have one unit that can have pins removed and another unit that cannot get pins removed other than passing order tests, they're going to winnow down and they're going to shoot at the unit that is not able to remove more than 1 pin per turn because those pins are going to stick, right? Unless the unit decides to rally, at which point they're effectively, out of action for an entire turn without getting even the benefits defensively of the down order, right? So, like there's a lot of questions, right? There's a lot of question marks that are available in terms of how you go about doing objective holding. But the simple one is try to keep him alive as long as possible. Try to keep as many of the units who are protecting the objective within range of the chaplain as possible. So that way they can choose the unit, they can remove the pins where you actually need them and where they'll be most effective. Similarly, for objective taking potential, a chaplain cannot take an objective, okay? It can help to keep your objective takers from having to rally, however, which is a really big deal. Because the last thing you want is to be pushing up toward an objective, a whole bunch of enemies start shooting at you in a single turn, maybe because, they maneuver around a transport and like 4 units drop out because it's a German transport with a ton of different dudes inside with an officer inside or whatever. And so you end up getting like a whole bunch of pins in a single turn. It might be really nice to be able to have a chaplain there to just be like, hey, I'm going to remove one because of our morale bubble that's nearby. You should still be able to reliably activate because you're getting like an 8 or 9 on average, right? That's and that would be enough to pass. Hey, if that's the case, go ahead and just keep firing, start winnowing down some of these guys who are here because we do have to actually clear the objective, right? And so you do have that option. Again, Geneva Convention comes into play. You might play against guys like me who are not going to shoot at them, which is always nice. Don't plan on it, but it might happen. And in addition, you can keep this guy in a transport. As long as it's not a fully enclosed armored transport, you can keep him inside the transport in order to affect the range, which is really nice. It also means that if you have to spread your men out a little bit more, you're working from the base of the transport as opposed to the base of the unit. And so if you have a case like, for example, that US chaplain over there, I'm not saying that the LVT is the best transport in the game. I think that's the M308 Scout car. But if you are looking at running an LVT and you've got a 24-man capacity and you happen to have 1 seat left over, putting a chaplain in there, even if just to give you a wide range of options of who to remove a pin on, including the LVT, could be really, really nice. So just things to think about, okay? So in terms of support prioritization, what do we want to prioritize? I think there's 4 orders that you want to do. These are the 4 different groups of people. By the way, over there you'll see Dewey Cat Productions has created a 3D print file just for a stole. And you can find this on Wargaming 3D. I think this is the best way to go about modeling chaplains because you can just get a model, right? Just get any old model. And as long as you put the stole on before you glue on the arms in the right way or something else like that, you can turn any model in the game into a chaplain by buying 1 3D print file and then printing it like 20 times, and you'll never need any more for the rest of your life, right? And so, my opinion, go ahead and check that out. Not to mention, just the team at Dewey Cat is fantastic. So huge fan. Go ahead and support them. Throw them some love. Throw them some money. Maybe even throw in some extra if you want to, because they do really good work over there and they're helping to level up the game for everybody. So go ahead and take a look at that. But in addition, the kind of the 4-part way you want to think about this is the first priority people you want your chaplain to remove the pin on are units that absolutely have to activate. So if you have a unit that is carrying the objective in something like, say, Top Secret, and that unit has to boogie it back to your side of the board, that is the kind of unit that you need to remove pins on because that unit must pass their order tests, okay? Similarly, if you have a unit that is holding an objective for you, and they're keeping the enemy from having it. You do not want those units running. You do not want those units foobarring. There's a lot of things you do not want them to do. You need them to be active. You need them to be fully under your control. Remove pins off of those units. Okay. If you have a firepower unit that has to be doing removal, so they cannot afford to fail an order test. They can't just rally. You need them to be pumping fire down range, right? These could be your DACA tanks. These could be your big units of submachine guns. It could be your, monstrosities like, if you're going to pay the points for a Tiger 1 or a Tiger 2, you don't want to rally, okay? You want to keep that thing moving. You got to keep that beast shooting at things. That's why you took it, okay? If you take any sort of Panzer Ace, and you paid for veteran status on a tank, you need that thing to keep firing. You got to keep the pins off of that thing. That is the chaplain's job, okay? In addition, if you have a transport and inside it's got multiple units, let's say that you've got like a 12-man capacity transport for the Germans, it's got a regular platoon commander, and it's got 2 5-man submachine gun squads in it. That transport, if it does not move on a given turn because it fails an order test, heaven forbid it backs up, bumps into the back of the board, and flees the battlefield with everybody inside of it. You need that transport to pass its order test because it has a trickle-down effect to a substantial percentage of your army. So because of that, prioritize the transport. Okay, you got to kind of think within this mindset. That is your first and primary priority. Even if it's just, it helps to improve the margin of making sure that you pass the order test, let alone making it so you have no pins at all. Those are the units you have to prioritize. Okay. The second kind of rung of units that I would prioritize on the ladder that is your prioritization is any unit that only has 2 pins on it. And the reason for this is if you remove one of them, especially if you're taking something like a veteran chaplain where you're more likely than not to actually remove the pin, it removes the first one. And then you remove the second one when they pass the order test, which in an ideal world, if it's an important unit to you, you have a morale bubble nearby, or you at least took it with a reasonable morale, so that way it will actually pass its order test. Now, when it actually performs its action, it's performing it without the problem of pins. So if it has to take a shot as part of a fire action, as part of an advance action, as part of an ambush action later in the turn, it's doing so without a -1 to hit penalty, which is really, really good. Now, similar, you can also use this to target a unit that only has 1 pin on it, okay? Just so that way, before it activates, it doesn't even have to take an order test at all. Again, it gets us back into the realm of this is a reliable unit that we can activate. The problem with this is most units that you would want to be able to reliably activate, if they have 1 pin on them, their order test is still more than likely to pass because they're probably regular or veteran, which means you're looking for an 8 or a 9 on 2 dice, looking for that number or lower. And so because of that, while you can technically do this, especially if they're a veteran unit, they were more likely than not to remove the pin anyway. And so you might be wasting your chaplain. So I'm not saying don't do this. I am saying the 2-pin unit is probably more of a high priority thing than the 1-pin unit because both of them are still relatively likely to pass their order test, if not very likely to pass their order test, depending on whether you have a morale bubble nearby. And on top of that, you're not wasting the ability to shed pins, if that makes sense, right? Another thing to think about, and this is kind of my third rung, if you want to, you can save the chaplain for a late turn activation. This is mostly useful in case you have a unit that is already activated in the turn. So let's say, for example, you have a DACA tank. We'll call it like a Panzer III Oshift G that can potentially have 3 machine guns on it, right? Shooting 12 shots per turn. Early on in the turn, you activate it, you start pumping lead down range, you've been doing a good job on removal, so the opponent reasonably decides to do retributive fire. They start shooting back at this tank later in the same turn. The tank can't react to that, tank can't do anything about that because it's already activated, right? And so because of that, it starts stacking pins. What you can choose to do with your chaplain is you can have your chaplain remove a pin off of that unit even though it's already activated for the turn. Because the thinking is you can either then activate it next turn and either it doesn't have any pins on it at all, or maybe it is down to just the 1. So then when it performs its order test, it removes the last pin. Now it's working pin free for the rest of the turn, which especially on those DACA tanks is something that you want. Alternatively, if it still has like 2 pins on it, for example, at the end of the turn, moving into the next turn, brand new turn, you could choose to activate the chaplain early, and now we're higher up on the rung. The tank is now a 2-pin unit, right? And so maybe you activate an officer who snap twos the chaplain and the tank, right? So that way there's no lag time. There's no ability for them to, shore up by throwing more pins on there. You quickly give orders. Who cares what the orders are, except as long as they're not down to the officer, not down to the chaplain. Boom, boom, you're good to go. You ideally remove that next pin. You're down to 1 pin now. Tank passes its order test because we have an officer nearby, and boom, it's working pin free, and it's back to doing its job, right? That's kind of the way you want to think about it. Late turn activation for the chaplain is not a bad idea because it allows you to kind of think ahead to next turn and potentially get the benefit of the double tap, right? Where you're using the chaplain ability, and then before the unit goes again, you use the chaplain ability a second time in the next round, and then the unit activates. Okay? Can be a very effective way. It kind of allows you to remove pins on a unit with 3 pins. It just requires a turn of setup, right? And so late activation options are a thing. They can be very effective, probably not necessarily as effective as the other ones, just because, again, there's a lot of margin for error as to how it goes. But that's, it's a thought as to how you might handle it. And then finally, if you don't have anything else better to do, you can target a heavily pinned unit, okay? The primary reason why you would want to do this is, let's say that you have a unit who has like 4 pins on it, which is quite a few. Even a veteran unit outside of a morale bubble is less likely than not to pass it, right? You could choose to remove a pin off of that just to improve your margin for success, especially if it's the kind of situation where the unit cannot really afford to rally, right? We talked earlier about how, if the unit has to activate because maybe they're the unit that is carrying the objective in top secret, you really don't want that unit standing still for a turn. Because if the enemy is maneuvering toward that unit to try to grab hold of it, 1 turn of not moving could be the end of that unit. And so because of that, you might be like, well, I can't really afford to just stop and rally with this unit, but they have like 4 pins on them. So what do I do? Well, I'm going to bring it down to 3 and hope to goodness that a veteran unit with a morale of 7 is going to be enough, right? Or something like that. This is one of the reasons why I really like using chaplains next to officers. Because in an ideal world, if you're within 6-inch range of the chaplain, you're also within 6-inch range of an officer, and therefore your margin is better for passing order test side of things and not failing a morale test, right? In case you get hit by a large amount of fire and you have to perform a morale test to avoid fleeing. The problem, of course, with this is in most situations, it is actually probably just better to rally because you're not improving the margin by all that much. It's only about 7%. It's not that big because it's a 2d6 roll, so it's not going to be a large swing. At the same time, depending on what units are in range, that might be the only option available for you. So I'm going to put it here as the bottom rung. It's not a bad thing to do, but I really don't think that should be your priority. The goal is not to even out and equivalize the number of pins you have on your units. The goal is to assess how important is it that this unit has pins, and is the number of pins that it has satisfactory for what I need it to do, right? And I think that's the best way to think about it for maximizing your chaplain. Because again, remember, you're only going to remove 2 to 4 pins on average in a single game, right? Your ceiling is a good bit better if you take it veteran because a 3+ is more likely to, more likely than not to get on the better side of luck. So there's that. But, I think there's a strategy behind what order you remove things in. And by simply doing that, you might find that you're able to make up a good bit of value over the course of the game. Okay. Now, there is one change that I would recommend, and this goes back to the fact that the chaplain is it's so swingy, and I don't want it to be a thing where it's easier for inexperienced chaplains to do their job. I want there to be a reason to take all 3, and I think the +1 and -1 for veteran and inexperienced respectively is a really good way of doing it. It's very elegant. It's very simple. But here's the change that I would make. I would allow the chaplain to perform their test either right after receiving their order or after performing the move portion of an advance or run order. And here's the reason why. First of all, because it makes sense that they would run over to the men that really need to hear it, and then they would encourage the men to do their job, right? And so I don't have a problem with that. Second of all, we're paying for really good chaplains 25 to 33 points. That's on par with, the pricing for this in general is on par with an AT rifle, which is, it's well priced, but it's not like you can fit 12 of them into most armies, right? Skew Soviet builds could probably do it, but in general, you're not spending, it's not like you're going to be spending much. It's also a case of, again, this is a company level asset, so you can only take 1 in your force. It doesn't matter how many platoons you have. So it's not like you can really abuse this all that well. But it does make it so that it's harder to gimmick away the benefits of a medic, right? Because of a chaplain. Because the problem that we have with the chaplain here is that what a guy just needs to do is, oh, okay, well, he's got a chaplain within 6 inches of those units, but he doesn't have any in range of these. So I'm just going to pummel these units that are also going to need his help. He's not really going to be able to use his chaplain, but now he sees a new place where he needs him. So he's going to move the chaplain over there. And then on the following turn, or maybe even later in the turn, depending on how early the chaplain activates, now I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff over at the other guy, and he's going to go over there and he's going to remove one pin, but then he's going to just run back. And we're basically just playing ping pong with the chaplain, possibly through ambush fire, right? Like there's just a lot of ways you can kind of mitigate the effectiveness of a chaplain because of the fact that there's only one of them. And so they cannot put them in multiple places. So personally, I'm okay with him being a little more mobile before using his special rule. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think it requires an extra points increase. And I think it would make it so there's more of a reason to take a chaplain because you have a little more autonomy with how you use your support bonus. Okay. It's still, again, not going to be that many pins removed each game, right? I mean, we're talking 2 to 4 on average, assuming he's alive for all 6 turns, which is an assumption because especially in a seek and destroy mission, I would imagine they see a one-man, possibly even inexperienced squad out there. I mean, I'm not going to lie, a lot of people would be tempted to break the Geneva Convention, right? A lot of people going to go after this guy, even though he's an unarmed support staff. I mean, on that level with non-combatant, right? That's out there. So yeah, I think it's a small change. I don't think it's a dramatic change. I don't think it would make a big difference. It doesn't even require us to change anything in the rulebook because chaplains are not mentioned in the rulebook. They're just purely tied to the army list. And so I think just having a little note out there that says that he can perform it after an advance or run order, I think that would be fine. But what do you think? Do you think this would overpower the chaplain? Do you think the chaplain's overpowered as it is and he definitely doesn't need a bump? Do you think that the chaplain's ability is just so niche and it's so unpredictable that even with this change, it would still not be worthwhile to take? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.